Citizens of the world, welcome back to another Keep Yours podcast where we try and keep a few more dollars in your wallet. We got quite a few things to discuss this week. Sorry we've been off for a little bit. I needed some time to myself and some home projects. So we are back to discuss what's been going on, and not a lot has changed in our COVID world. But there's plenty of things to discuss. So let's get right to it, and we'll start with the good news. The good news is the government finally changed some of the PPP rules, and again, we're going with interim final rules, which it's very disturbing when the government can't come up with nomenclature that actually makes logical sense to anybody. Anyone who took in third grade English class could figure out that the word interim and the words final should not go together. But hence, this is what we're living with the Treasury Department. So we go on that basis. But basically, they gave us two options now. You can use your money over 8 weeks, or you can use your money over 24 weeks. Now, this is kind of a good news, bad news scenario, depending on your situation. For those people whose businesses haven't been able to yet open, the 24-week period might make a lot of sense. For those of us who used the money as soon as they gave it to us because we were in this tight 8-week window, about which the Treasury Department was being very meticulous, I'm going to use is, I guess, the nicest word I can use to say what they were doing. But they got very concerned with potential for audits, and all of a sudden they were on this 8 out of 52, and you only had 56 days to use your money and what you could use it on, and very specifics and threats of audits and the rest of the good nonsense from our Treasury Department. So they seem to have backed off on that quite a bit. They've created an easy form for a lot of businesses that can file. If you can check one of the three boxes that basically says either you're a single member, or you've retained all of your employees, or you've got some extenuating circumstances based on CDC guidance where you weren't able to open. And that'll make it a lot easier for a lot of people to file for forgiveness, and hopefully most of this money is indeed treated as grants. They should have just treated it as grants and left it up to business owners to decide how to use it, but that's not the way our government works. They want control, and they've got it. So the new 24-week period, especially if you're self-employed, this makes for a lot less paperwork. And even if you're not self-employed, if you still got all of your employees at the end of the period, this is going to be a ton easier. And the reason is all you'll have to provide for backup is payroll reports instead of all of the different potential things that you're going to need. So all funds, basically, if you're self-employed, should be forgiven. You move to the 24-week period, and it's going to max out, but your loan was maxed out as well at the 2.5 months, and that's basically where they've maxed it out. So that's good news. That means for almost all self-employed people, this loan is entirely forgivable. You don't have to worry about rent. It's just forgivable based on wages alone. And that's kind of fair, I think more fair for everybody, but nothing's ever fair, so we just deal with their interim final rules until they change them, and then we go from there. But for those of us who were expecting the 8-week period, the 8-week period is still allowable. If you had everything set up to do in your 8 weeks, great. Now here's the last piece of advice that this is from me, and this is the advice of don't be the first to file. Now, again, they seem to have backed off on the restrictions that they tried to impose of the fear of audits and what we're going to do and who we're going to come after. But here's my thought on that. Assuming that they are going to audit some of these files to try and keep congressional people happy, if they have hired these people, then they're sitting around right now waiting for files to come across their desk. So if you're the first one to file, then it's very likely that you go on somebody's desk just because they don't have anything to do. And our 8-week period for most people probably came up about 2 weeks ago for the earliest people that got money. So for the last few weeks, there's been quite a few people who now have the ability to go file and get their money forgiven. But again, no reason to be on top of the pile. Much better to be in the middle with millions and millions of other claims. And especially if you're self-employed, I would expect that there's very little chance of audit because the 24-week period is basically, it's free money. If you've only got a couple of employees, the same thing. Now, they did do some interesting things with some of these rules. So here's our changes. Again, the options are for an 8-week period or a 24-week period. So the law now says that there's a 40% limit on non-payroll expenses. So you can use 40% for rent, utilities. Basically, the idea is give business owners, especially those in high rent areas, a couple of extra options to use the money for rent. Now, if you still don't maintain your staff, then a percentage of your loan will be unforgivable, regardless of what it's used for. So let's say you retained 80% of your staff, but you used 40% of the money for rent. Well, not all 40% will be forgivable. 80% of that 40% would be. So 32% of the amount you paid for rent, or 80% of your loan total. And if you do not have the same number of people, if you weren't able to retain all your staff, or you weren't able to open immediately, or have hired all your staff back by the end of your 24-week period, then you might be subject to limitations, in which case you can't file the EZ form. You got to file the whole form. And I'm going to do a podcast on the actual forms. I have a lot of that prepped, but again, since there's no urgency to do it, and I don't want to be in the middle of the I want to be in the middle of the pile, not the front of the line. This is different. When it came to getting the money, you kind of wanted to be in the front of the line. Now it turns out that they changed it and there's still money available. Might have been better to almost be at the back of the line, but so it goes. So again, for the time, you're going to use an 8-week period or a 24-week period, which is for some people going to be a good thing, for some bad. So for everybody who did the planning on 8 weeks, who brought all their employees back, paid them for the 8 weeks, and that money's up, you might still need to use the 8 weeks. And I had this situation myself, not due to PPP money, but due to customer contracts. Something else, we had a reduction of income. So after we used all of our PPP money, we're now going to have a ongoing reduction of income, which means we need to lay some people off. So while the 24-week period might have been beneficial and easier to follow, I'm going to be stuck using the 8-week period because that's what our planning was and that's what we retained people through. And there could be a lot of businesses in this kind of middle ground of their 8-week or 24-week period, which the 24-week period obviously makes sense for using more money for rent and utilities and other things. But if you don't have the ability to maintain all of your staff, then the 8-week period could be better for you. And if you're in between, I would suggest discussing this with your CPA or another financial advisor to get some good advice on which one to use and why, based off of who you're going to be able to retain. Now, here's the other thing. You know what the 8 and 24-week periods are. So no one's expecting a required application for forgiveness till at least the 24 weeks. So the other option is wait till the end of the 24 weeks, then figure out what's best. You can still file under the 8 or 24 and file later this year under what's best for you. So there's a little bit of planning that could be involved. And as I said, for myself, I'm going to end up using the 8-week period because that's the planning I did. We actually gave people bonuses to make sure we used all the money within that 56 days. And unfortunately, due to different circumstances, not COVID related, but a loss of contract, we're forced to lay some people off. So we would need that 8-period week to close as our forgiveness period, because after that, otherwise we'd lose the reduction of our loan amount. And I think a lot of people may be in that situation as well. I've read about some stories where people have hired people back and now they're forced to lay them off again. So depending on how you did your planning, whichever one works for you. Now here's the reason why it's so much simpler. In increasing the 24-week period, and again, remember that the maximum salary allowance was $100,000 before benefits. Well, now with 24 weeks, 24 out of the 56 weeks, they're allowing a deduction per employee of up to $46,000. This is why this makes your loan very forgivable. Again, you only got 2.5 months of people's salary, but now you're able to use 24 weeks, which is effectively 6 months. but obviously slightly less because, again, the Treasury goes to 24 out of 52 weeks. And so, but per employee is $46,000. So if you were expecting only to be able to forgive 15 and now it's triple that, by waiting the 24-week period, the only information you have to give the government is payroll. And it's likely to be double, if not 2.5 times, 3 times your loan amount just on payroll. So if you're able to retain all of your staff, you brought everybody back, you still have work to do, that's great. It gives you a easy path forward where you've got a lot more forgivable money than you need forgiven, which is nice. Now, here's the interesting part of that. So for an employee, you can go to $46,154. But as an owner, your salary limit forgiveness is limited to what the previous amount of the 2.5 times on the 100,000. So effectively closer to 6 weeks, but it's $20,833. Now they didn't give any explanation for why I can get if I've got 5 employees, I can get a deduction for each of my employees up to $46,000, but for myself, it's only $20,000. There's no explanation for why this is, but I think what they've done is they said, okay, for self-employed people, that's the maximum amount you could have received anyway. So that's the maximum amount we're going to give you for loan forgiveness. And because that's the thing for self-employed people, that's the number, we're just going to expand that and put that down for all owners. I think that could be challenged if there's people who don't have that many employees. I am not sure where you would need that number to be a lot higher. I can't really think of the situation in which the owner's salary for forgiveness would be a lot higher. But it could be one of those situations where you had multiple employees and you weren't able to bring them back, and you're trying to just get you're trying to have it all eligible and then reduced by the percentage loss of employees. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. But that's what they've said. And obviously, since that $20,833 was the max amount of loan for anyone doing self-employment, that means that your whole thing's basically forgivable. And that's why I said you can just wait. So that's all good news on the PPP program. And we'll see if the government comes up with some more money for it, because as we transition into this, the reckoning is coming in July. And here's what I've seen over the last couple of weeks that's drawn my attention. So the first was 2 articles together in the Friday. Hold on, I'll pull up the date for you specifically. It was Friday, June 12th, I believe, when I saw these 2 articles together. And the first one was the repo man has no work. And this is a very interesting article to me because COVID has stopped all things, not just all things COVID related. And when I mean all things, I don't mean it shut down everything. What I mean is, in terms of how things are moving through the system that we have set up, COVID stopped everything. So let's say you didn't pay your car payment in January, February, and March of this year, and they were about to repo your car. Well, all of a sudden, because of COVID, there's no more repossessions. So even though your lack of payment had nothing to do with COVID, now all of a sudden you get to keep your car for another 3 or 4 months without making any payments because no one can go repossess it right now. So we've got I don't want to call people bad actors. It's just bad, could be bad situations. But we have those that are in financial crises before the pandemic, and then those during. And those have all gotten mashed together. And no one can differentiate the two. And therefore, while the repo agents who are usually collecting cars and the auction houses that are usually processing to get them back in circulation, they're basically all shut down because they're not allowed to repo cars. So this article on Eddie the repo guy from Erie, Pennsylvania, he talks about kind of the normal flow of how many cars he would repo each month. Well, now all of the cars that would have been repoed in March are all getting extended. In addition to that, you've got potentially a whole lot of people who haven't made payments during COVID. And that's a whole different thing. And I apologize if you guys are picking up any of this wind noise. It's a very windy day here. I've tried to make this as quiet as possible, but we can only do so much with Mother Nature, as we're obviously in this COVID situation. It's very apparent. So back to the reckoning. The fact that there's no repossessions going on, there's no evictions happening. Well, that means that all of these are stored up in the system. And John Oliver's bit last night was on home evictions, and that those are coming in mass too. And while evicting people from a place has been illegal during COVID, doing the paperwork to evict somebody who's not making their rent payment has still happened. So the courts have a large backlog of people who are potentially getting evicted, and equally a large backlog of cars that are potentially getting repossessed. And this is why I've discussed this fall, I expect there to be a large drop in used car prices as well as apartment prices. But right now, that's not happening because all the evictions and all of the repossessions have been deferred. And again, I have no problem with deferring the hardship that we've all dealt with COVID. And unfortunately, there's not an easy way to extend. But at the same time, if you had a job, you've been given at least either you're still working, and if you are, you're lucky. And if you're not, then you've been given a big bump in unemployment benefits. And that has actually increased income for American families while we're not working, which in and of itself seems crazy to me, but that's what's happened. So the repo man has no work right now, but I'm pretty sure he's going to be really, really busy. And hopefully Eddie the repo man got some of that PPP money to help to get him through. But he's going to be really busy come this fall. And the other thing that's in here in this article about the repossession is there's a few different pieces in here on different lenders and how many loans are in forbearance or are delayed, or basically how many people are not paying their bills right now. And I've talked about this many times on this podcast about the amount of debt that Americans have. And again, consumer debt keeps rising to all-time highs. And that's a part of the problem, that we've got so much debt. But again, a lot of people aren't making payments. And this article talks about how many people are not. For the Erie Federal Credit Union, of which this guy works, they said of their $335 million in loans, 40% of them are for cars. And they, quote, say the auto book was a little scary. I would say is a little scary. And there's a lot of those people who haven't been making payments. So banks are increasing their loan loss amounts. They're also laying off people, which is going to continue. And more people who don't make their payments, are eventually going to get foreclosed on. This is just unfortunate, but it's an inevitable. And again, some of this is really COVID related and it's sad. Some of this is people just not paying their bills and they weren't paying them before. And a lot of it's people living beyond their means. And cars specifically. I did a podcast before about last year, the underwriting on cars. 30% of cars were underwater when they got bought, which meant that even more cars were underwater the day after they got bought. Because when they buy a car and you drive it off the lot, it's losing value immediately, especially if it's a new car. And this is a problem and has been for some time. And I think partly due to lack of financial education, but partly into people not wanting to live within their means and buying more than they can. So there's a lot of cars that are that payments are not being made on. And as these rules that we live with right now, no repossessions come off the books, I expect we're going to see a ton of them. The next article that I saw right after, the repo guys got no work is immediately it's Americans are missing payments, millions and millions of payments on their debt. Now, some of that is government inferred. In fact, the largest piece of it is student loan payments, but the government said everyone didn't have to make them. So if the government said you didn't have to make it, then you haven't missed any payments. But there's a lot of payments that haven't been made. Personal loans increase in default. Car loans is one of the big ones. In this one, Capital One talks about they're working with customers. And here's the other piece of this is everyone's trying to help out because they realize that a lot of people are in trouble, not because of their own doing, but because they lost their job because COVID and the government shut businesses down. But Capital One said that 13% of its auto loan accounts were in forbearance. 13% of people not making payments. And again, I question why there's so many people not making rent payments, not making loan payments, with the exception of if you live in an extremely high cost of living area like New York and you got laid off or your unemployment doesn't cover the rent. If you live in New York or San Francisco and your money just doesn't, your whole unemployment check doesn't cover the rent, then I get it. But 13% of people, because usually those people make a lot of money as well. And a lot of times they don't have car payments. So if everybody else is getting extra unemployment money, then 13% of car loans aren't being made. That tells me that a couple things are happening. One, people are taking advantage. So because I can get my loan put into forbearance, all I have to do is pick up the phone and call. Hey, can you extend my payments? Add them on to the end. Pay interest only. Or just don't pay anything right now and add them on to the end later. Make it, instead of missing 3 or 4 payments now, I'll pay 5 at the end. And that's reasonable, especially with a business or an individual. If you've got a mortgage right now or a car payment, and you're not using the car, so it's just sitting in your driveway. Well, the value of that car is the amount of times it can drive you to and from work, let's say. And if it's good for 10,000 trips, well, while you're sitting at home, the value of the car is not being reduced because none of those trips are being made. So in that context of the value of the asset and when you make the payments on it, it makes sense that those could be made on the end. But I don't think that's going to be the case here with a lot of people. I think it's going to be the case that a lot of people are just taking advantage of the system and that a lot of people aren't going to have the money to make their payments when they come due. And that repo guy is going to go from not having work to being so busy they can't pick up all the cars. And you have another problem that happens in the middle of this, which is it becomes very hard for the banks to figure out who they will and will not loan money to going forward because they don't know that the data that they're getting is relevant. Because if my loan's in forbearance, then maybe it's not being reported to the credit agency. Or maybe it is. And for those of you who don't know, and I'll talk about this again later in some of the ideas, is that if you don't need to have your home put into forbearance and miss a couple of mortgage payments and have them added on at the end, you should not. If you still have a job, you're still working, and you can make that payment, make that payment. Because if you miss a payment, all of a sudden you become ineligible for at least a period of time, potentially 6 months to a year, from refinancing. That's a problem, especially since right now is a good time to refinance. So I just thought it was very interesting that these two articles were right next to each other. And it's one of those things that when I see something like this, it tells me, whoa, nothing's making logical sense here. Americans are missing tons of loan payments and not paying for things, and the repo guy's not repossessing anything. That's not the way the system works. The system is set up such that there's this sort of constant churn. Some people fall in hard times. Some people get overextended. Some people want to buy a new car that they really can't afford. And then when they can't make the payments, here comes the repo guy. But what it does is it puts those assets right back into the world. So it gets repossessed That it gets taken to an auction, sold at auction, put back on a dealership lot, car is sold again. Everybody makes a little bit of money along the way. The banks lose some. The consumer typically loses the most. The consumer gets wiped out, and not to mention terrible on your credit report. But the car is now is back in the system. So instead, now we have all of these assets that are not flowing into the system. So if you looked at used car prices right now, they're probably not as low as they should be. And there's a few things contributing to that. A, there's a little bit increase in demand from people who no longer want to take public transportation because they don't feel safe because of COVID. So they're buying cars. In the same respect, you have that going on in real estate where people are moving out of the cities because when you got stuck in an apartment for months at a time, you realize this isn't a good idea. That added along with not just protests, because I don't think anyone's got a problem with the protests, but the rioting and looting that's kind of happened. I don't want to say alongside because I don't think that's what it is. I think it's bad actors who are taking advantage of the situation and doing the rioting and looting. I think most of the protesters are actually protesting injustice, and that's just being used as we'll call it a decoy for those that want to go commit crimes. But when millions of people are missing payments and the repo man's not working, the system is stuck. And that means that current pricing doesn't make any sense because it doesn't have all of the normal things factored into it. So the price of a used car right now is going to go down when the repo man starts selling his cars. And also when Hertz starts selling all of theirs cars because they don't own theirs either. So these are just missing pieces in a puzzle. And that's the way I view the whole thing. It's a big puzzle. And when I see things like this, especially in the same day's paper, I'm going, wait a minute. In today's paper, there's things that just don't make any sense to me. There's just this factor of no payments being made and then no consequences from that. And that doesn't make sense. So the other thing that we've seen over the last few weeks is the frauds start coming out. And the big one, Wirecard from Germany, that was a huge one. We've also seen Luckin Coffee go down the drains. It's actually being delisted in New York because of false sales. And every time there's a recession, just like in 2009, we got Madoff and a few other Ponzi schemes go along with it. Now all of a sudden, we see a few of these other things. I would say those are kind of normal case. Good to get those out in the open. Unfortunately, it takes something like I'm going to call this a depression because I think that's what we're going to be in for a while, to happen. We still have 20 million people unemployed. The jobs return is not looking nearly as good as everyone would have hoped, and that's going to be a long-term problem. I've been saying that since day one. Unfortunately, our economy was set up for a recession just because of the massive debt loads anyway. The only reason we aren't in a deep depression that's going to be ongoing is because the Fed's been printing money, and that's helping things, but that's going to have its own consequences later, which is the main topic of today's podcast. Printing money. So when the government starts printing money, which is good in a short-term crisis, but bad because it's been long-term policy. So MMT stands for Modern Monetary Theory, which is this kind of new idea that inflation's not really real and we can kind of borrow as much money as we want to because we control the printing press. And we're going to discuss how that works. But we also see oil and gas bankruptcies. Chesapeake Energy filed, I think, today. And there's going to be more and more harm in the oil patch, less and less investment. That's also going to be a strain on economic growth for the long term. And those are good paying jobs that are fewer and far between now. And of course, the biggest problem is we lack any leadership nationally, and so we don't have a plan. And this slide's from the prior one. I just copied it back in here because we still don't know. So we don't know if we're waiting for this vaccine or can we get some herd immunity. One thing that bothers me is that I saw one article early in the New York Times, and I saw Dr. Rhonda Patrick mention it as she was departing the Joe Rogan podcast, like literally the last thing she said. And that's that we're doing no research into viral load. And viral load is a very simple concept that says, how much of the virus do you get? And it's possible that a lot of the people who are asymptomatic because, let's say somebody sneezed and they walked by a minute later and just got a little bit of that sneeze. Let's say they were on the outside of the burst of somebody sneeze. Or their neighbor had it and they had a 30-second conversation with their neighbor and just got a little bit of the virus. But the idea behind viral load is if we could figure out what the lowest dosage is that would get somebody sick, but have the least likelihood to get them really sick, then I think a lot of the young people, especially based off of the numbers that have come out recently. If you haven't seen the numbers recently, the CDC said they think 10 times more people in America have been exposed to COVID and had it than the numbers say, than the testing says. So that means 20 million people. And the World Health Organization and the data out of Europe is saying that realistically it's people over 75 that are dying. There are more deaths from accidents from children than there are from deaths from COVID-19 over the last 3 months. So we got to remember that people die all the time. So we can't say that one person dying is too many. If one person dying was too many, then we would all realistically be locked in our house with no knives and no sharp edges, so we can't fall down, no stairs because we could fall down the stairs and die. We would not be allowed to move around at all. We wouldn't have life. So at some point, we've got to choose. And I think that the herd immunity at this point, I don't think you can put this virus back in the bottle, unfortunately. Now, had they known when this first came out of Wuhan, had they shut down international travel immediately, had this disease not gotten to the U.S. In the form that it did, with so many people being infected and kind of nobody really understanding how it was being spread, no contact tracing, no figuring it out, we're not going to be able to do what New Zealand did and get rid of this virus. So what are we going to do next? I think we really need to go to herd immunity. I think the vaccine option is a chance. We might get a vaccine, we might not. And what's the long-term consequences of the vaccine to anybody? We just don't know. Determining vaccine efficacy takes time, and that's the thing that we don't have. We've already seen what the economic damage of this is, and it's getting worse. And again, we're about to go through the math of what's going to happen next. And the longer we have partial opening, the longer we have businesses that just can't do what they do, the bigger the fallout and the longer it's going to stay with us. And we've had sad news in our community already. The yoga studio where my wife and I met has gone out of business and is bankrupt, and so is the owner. So the owner, because I assume, I don't actually know the intricate details of the situation, but she did say they got PPP money and they spent all that. And now they still owe rent, but they can't be open or can only be partially open, and they just don't have the rent money. The overhead's just too much. So she's filing personal bankruptcy as well, I assume because she's personally signed on the lease, which is common for all small business owners. We're all signed on for everything personally. It's an unfair part of small business right now that all small business owners have to sign up for the potential losses of the business, which makes her bankrupt, lost her business that she's been running for 20 years, and unemployed. And that's very sad to me because that's of no thing that she did. She did not do anything specifically to warrant that. And after that yoga studio closed, it took about 2 weeks before the next one closed. And I expect we'll see more and more and more small businesses fail because their business models and the rent do not accommodate what's going on. And I think landlords are still in the early phases of this, not realizing that it's going to be very hard for them to get tenants back because who's going to want to take on that risk? And I have always been a huge proponent of small business owners and making sure that small business owners get the respect that they deserve. Everyone wants to believe that a small business should have a huge amount of money stored up for hard times. And if you actually understand how a business operates, the small margins it operates under, and the taxes that the business and the business owner have to pay, it's unrealistic. You're basically asking a business owner to not take any profits for a decade so that they can have an emergency fund that covers something like this. And if that's the requirement, we're going to see fewer and fewer people start small businesses. And that's horrible for the entire country, because small businesses are where people want to work. No one wants to work for a huge company where you're a number, and whether or not you're there doesn't really matter. So unfortunately, that's been some of the sad news of the reality of we've seen. And this is when, for me, it's gotten very personal about these people are losing their businesses and the government still has no plan. Federally, nationally, we just have a lack of leadership, a huge void of leadership of what are we doing. And instead, we get told that this administration has done the best job possible. They're an amazing administration, the best one that the country's ever seen, and they've saved millions of lives, which to me, they've done basically nothing. And again, no plan, no leadership going forward. They'd just rather hope to ignore it and hope the Fed can print enough money to keep the stock market running. So this brings us to modern monetary theory, aka the belief that it's free money. And the excerpts that I'm going to take out of this are out of an article that Sarah will link into the notes from the Wall Street, not from the Wall Street Journal, from the New York Times. And this is written by Stephanie Kelton, and she is an economist and the author of The Deficit Myth. And she has bought in wholeheartedly to modern monetary theory. And let's talk about what's happening right now, first of all. So the government's printed basically $3 trillion over the last 2 months. Now, not all of that's in circulation yet, but everyone's eligible for unemployment, which has never happened before. Everyone's getting an extra $600 a week in unemployment money as well. So average personal income in April and May went up 7%. So this is hard to wrap your head around. I had to read it twice because I went, wait a minute. People are not working. They're at home doing nothing, and personal income went up. Unemployment is at an all-time high, but income went up. But produced goods went way down. So if you just took this at its basic, simple level of supply and demand economics, there's more money in the system and fewer goods. Supply and demand economics say that if that same amount of money was being spent, which it's not because the savings rate went up too, if the same amount of money was being spent on those same goods that are available, 15% less available goods, 7% more money. What's that tell you? That the same amount of there's only the certain amount of goods available, 7% more money chasing it. Effectively, you would have an immediate 15% less goods, 7% more money. That's like an immediate 20% spike. If all the money was spent the same each month, and this happened. So all the money isn't being spent. That's part of the issue of why we don't have inflation right now. But that's a big problem. You can't keep doing that. You just can't. So the PPP money kept people on payroll, but again, they weren't producing goods necessarily. Some of them were, some of them weren't. But now what? Those people are going to start getting laid off if the businesses can't keep going, if they don't have the same amount of demand. The Federal Reserve is buying all types of bonds, including many that it'll take losses on from companies that have terrible ratings. And you could view that as you and me are now buying these bonds. We, the people, are buying bonds of companies that we would never buy the bonds of. And that's a huge, huge handout to all sorts of people on Wall Street. All sorts of speculators in bonds went, oh, the Federal Reserve is going to buy these. Now they're worth face value, even though the company underlying them is going to have problems. And then what's next? Is there more money printing coming? Because the PPP money, for a lot of us, the 8 weeks is up. We already spent it. The unemployment extra ends July 31st. We are no closer to being done with this COVID thing, especially the erratic government opening, closing, 20%, 30%, 80% of your business can be open, 50% for the bars, 25% for the restaurants. Oh, we're going to increase it, decrease it. Changing rules all the time. Well, I'll tell you what's really, really difficult as a business owner when you constantly change the rules. I don't know if I have a business at 50% occupancy if I'm running a restaurant. Depends how much takeout business I still do. Now, all of a sudden, you change that to 25% or you close me down for another month. I have no idea. So as businesses fail, there's going to be none restarted. That's the normal churn is just like the repo market. Some people don't make car payments. Those cars get repossessed, sold at auction, sold to somebody else. The car's being driven again. But that means you don't need to make another car because that car is in circulation. Now we're going to have the same problem with businesses. Everything's stuck. So one business closes, but there's not another one reopening. There's not another one to take its place. That's going to be bad for everybody. So let's discuss modern monetary theory basics. Now, I will say that the New York Times did not publish this as though it's true. It is an opinion piece, which I'm grateful that they put in there. However, there's a lot of people, especially the AOC contingent, that believe the government can just print money and putting into any programs that they want. But this is based off of what her article is, which is Learn to Love $1 trillion deficits, which is in and of itself a crazy idea. So the basic theory is this, that governments that control their own currency can increase spending without needing to raise taxes or borrow currency from other countries or investors, because you basically own your own printing press. The only economic constraints currency issuing states face are inflation and the availability of labor and other material resources in the real economy. And the idea is that, okay, is there labor in your country to do the job that you need done? And can you get material resources within your own country? And the more you're able to do that, then the less you're reliant on somebody else, and therefore the less of somebody else's currency you may need. For example, let's assume that there were no trees in the United States and that all of the tree product that we got was imported from Canada. Well, then we wouldn't have the materials to build houses here, so we would have to get Canadian dollars and to buy Canadian wood. And therefore that would increase our price significantly, especially when we print more money. And MMT goes on, she says the state's ability to make and enforce tax laws that sustains a demand for dollars, which in turn make those dollars valuable. So she's basically saying because we can always raise taxes, then we'll always be able to repay our debts. And instead of worrying about the number that falls out of the budget box at the end of each fiscal year, MMT asks us to focus on the limits that matter. Now, she won't say what those limits are. It won't say, hey, how much is too much? But she says the limits are not in our government's ability to spend money or to sustain large deficits. Modern monetary theory distinguishes the real limits from wrong-headed self-imposed constraints. So she basically tells us all that we're wrong, and all the constraints that we've been living under by not spending money for future generations are self-imposed constraints. And this is where all of a sudden it becomes a license to print all of the money that you want. However, she misses some of the main assumptions that the rest of us have about modern monetary theory. So the first that she doesn't discuss very much, especially when it comes to the US dollar, because if you took another country that she talks about that can print their own money, So let me back up here and see whoever she prints. Okay, Japan. So Japan's a good example. So if Japan continues to print money and increases their money supply, while domestically they can do that, it will reduce the value of their currency compared to US dollars or other world reserve currencies. So the US dollar right now is the world's reserve currency. And what that means is that when two other countries, let's say you've got a miner in Australia who's mining iron ore, and you've got a farmer in Indonesia who's growing rice, and they want to exchange. Somebody else in Indonesia wants the iron ore, and the guy in Australia wants to buy rice. Well, the guy in Australia might not want to take Indonesian currency, and the Indonesian people might not want to take Australian currency. So instead, what they do is they agree, we'll both use dollars. And they use dollars because dollars have been, as the world's reserve currency, fairly stable. Meaning the value that they're going to get in that dollar, in their own currency, matches what they're giving up. Versus, all of a sudden, if Australia decides to print some more money, all of a sudden, now they need more Australian dollars. And then they have to exchange those Australian dollars for Indonesian dollars, which is what they want. So if you're the Indonesian rice farmer, you want Indonesian dollars because that's what you're going to spend locally. But now all of a sudden you have to take these Australian dollars and exchange them. And if Australia keeps printing money and has inflation, those dollars become worth less and less. Hence, that's where inflation comes from. So all of a sudden, the Indonesian farmer would require more Australian dollars to buy his rice. And just like when we talked about way back, if you go back to the beginning episodes, and we talked about why we need money as an exchange, because there's too many things to price money in to just have a barter system, right? How much rice from Indonesia do you give to the guy in Australia who's mining ore, and how much rice does he want? And then he has to give that rice to other people and try and figure it out and exchange and barter goods. But what people want is a system where they know the value of all of the items. And to do that, in the world right now, everyone uses US dollars for the most part. So the US dollar as the reserve currency is what sustains the demand for dollars, right? Stephanie's saying that the MMT says that no, the fact that the US government can tax its citizens means there's demand for US dollars. But that's only works for Japan. That doesn't work if you're the world's reserve currency and everyone's using it. Demand is driven in large part because all the people in Australia and Indonesia are conducting transactions in dollars, which means they need dollars to do so. So they're exchanging their local currency for dollars, moving it across borders in dollars, and those dollars are then locally exchanged again. But there's a demand for dollars on both sides. So all of a sudden, if the US dollar is no longer the reserve currency, demand could fall a lot. And this is the problem with modern monetary theory, is that it doesn't apply to the reserve currency, because if you keep printing money, while you can do that, people will stop using it as the reserve currency. So why did the dollar become the world's reserve currency? Because after World War II, it was the currency that was pegged to gold. That's the only reason that everyone in the world agreed upon it. It's, oh, well, it's attached to gold, so I know how many dollars I'm going to exchange for how much gold. And when that was the case, we had very low inflation. Then all of a sudden they decided, well, we'd like to run the printing presses in the United States. We don't have enough gold, so we have to remove it from the gold standard. Now, if the US dollar was removed from the gold standard before it became the reserve currency, my inclination is that the US dollar would not have become the world's reserve currency. Because why? There would have been no reason for people to do that. Everyone would have conducted transactions in their own currency and taken the risk. The Australian miner and the Indonesian farmer wouldn't have exchanged for dollars. They would have just dealt in their own local currencies and figured it out, which is likely what's going to happen again, because at some point, if the U.S. runs enough deficits, then it doesn't have enough money. I mean, it owes so much money that if you raise the interest rate, then all of a sudden the deficits grow more and more, and you can't just tax your way out of it. The government collected $4 trillion last year. It's going to print $8 trillion this year it's going to spend. So 50% of our budget we don't have. That means future generations have to pay for that. And there's also debt service. Now, while interest rates are low, the debt service isn't very high. So this modern monetary thing works. But what happens when we're no longer the reserve currency, when demand falls and inflation does happen because they printed so many more dollars? Then what? And they don't have an answer for that. And they say, well, it just won't happen. But I think they're wrong. So if the US dollar is no longer on the gold standard, then there's really no reason for the world to continue to accept dollars all the time, except for it used to. But it continues to until the US dollar runs into trouble. And that's about to happen. And there's no reason that other currencies, like Australia dollars, can't go onto the gold standard and therefore start conducting transactions effectively in gold, which has been the store of value for a long time. So when people tell you right now that they're investing a lot in gold and silver, they're not saying the value of gold and silver is going up. What they're really saying is the value of the dollar is going down. And that, from a supply-demand perspective, makes sense. When they keep printing money and increasing the amount of dollars in supply, again, incomes went up 7% in the 2 months where production went down 15%. That doesn't make sense. You can't have more dollars chasing fewer goods. So when does it come time to pay the bills, so to speak? Well, when the world no longer believes that the U.S. debt is sustainable, which we're pretty close to that. I mean, we talk about how crazy Greece's debt was in 2008, 2009. The U.S. is approaching that. The U.S. debt is like Greece, Italy, and Spain. It's a huge percentage of GDP. So if the world decides that the U.S. isn't going to really be able to repay its debts and it's going to have inflation, then it's going to stop using dollars, which will decrease the demand for dollars. And not only will we have inflation from money printing, but the reduction in demand from everyone else transacting in U.S. dollars could make inflation even higher because nobody wants them anymore. And this is the part that modern monetary theory misses. It's the assumptions that the rest of us make and how things work that modern monetary theory requires that everyone keep accepting your dollars. They think that demand for dollars just remains forever high. Why? No answer. Because they talk about that, oh, there are constraints, but they don't say what those constraints are. And by the time you get to that constraint, it's a problem. So then the other question is, why haven't we seen inflation yet? The government's been printing money for a while. In fact, the government's been heavily printing money since the 2008 crisis, since the financial crisis. So one of the reasons is the Fed's been buying dollars back from banks. And this is a tricky little way to not increase the money supply. So again, if wages increased 7% and goods decreased 15%, you have a lot more dollars chasing fewer goods, which means prices rise. But the reason, and some prices have risen, as we've seen, especially from shortage, like ground beef. I saw a sign at King Soopers the other day, $8.99 a pound. That's crazy, but that's supply demand. Demand is still high. The supply's been reduced, right? There's no actual shortage of cows. It's just a shortage in the supply chain from COVID. But you have a similar thing going on in banking. So prior to the 2008 crisis, if banks had extra money sitting on the sidelines, they just didn't make any money on it. And the way that works is basically a bank has to have reserves, which are typically your savings dollars. And they're allowed to loan those out usually about 10 times for each dollar. Any extra they have, they now send to the Fed, and the Fed pays them interest on that. It's called sweeps, and it happens every night. Well, all of the money the banks are giving back to the Federal Reserve, that's keeping that money out of the money supply. If the Federal Reserve's not giving them any interest on that, then they'd be more inclined to loan that money out to make more money or distribute money to their shareholders because they don't need the reserves, and therefore the shareholders do something else productive with that money, putting it back into the money supply. But right now, that money's not in the money supply. And then they say we've had no inflation over the last 10 years. But again, this is how they measure inflation. right? And they have come up with these very strategic things of a way to talk about it. Instead of just going, what's the increase that everyone has to pay each year for all things? They like to not include housing specifically. So I don't know about you, but almost every housing market in the U.S. seems to have gone up. Denver has basically doubled in the last 10 years in terms of price. Now, some of that can be attributed to demand. People want to move to Colorado. But there's got to be an inflation factor part of that as well. Now, one of the things that's also happened on the real estate side that's made assets allowed to be more expensive is that interest rates continue to go down. And when interest rates drop, you have more buying power, and that's allowed prices to rise. Well, what happens when it goes the other way? Yeah, that's the problem. It's going to go the other way eventually. So in my mind, real asset prices have been higher. Price of cars have gone up. A few things have become less expensive, but things are supposed to become less expensive. As technology increases to increase productivity, things are supposed to reduce in price. So all prices aren't supposed to rise all the time. But the main things that people have to pay for, right? And we see it all in the numbers. The amount that households spend on rent every month has continued to rise way faster than they say inflation's risen. And price of assets has risen a lot more than what they've said this less than 2% inflation has been. So in reality, we have seen inflation. It's just that it's hidden in the government numbers of what they like to show us. Again, we go back to everybody making more money. So incomes are up 7%, but no one's producing goods. Now the savings rate's increased. So if everyone's saving, and especially if that money is literally in a savings account, then that money's not in the money supply yet. And we have the same thing with government loans. So the government's given out all of these extra loans and printing the money to do so. But that money doesn't mean that it's been spent yet. Even though they printed all the money for the PPP program, doesn't mean all the businesses have spent that money yet. Or if they did spend that money, since money's fungible, meaning I can exchange, I had money in my savings account for my business. Now you get my PPP money. I spent my PPP money. I didn't spend my savings money. So not all of that money is in the money supply yet. What happens when it starts getting in there? These are the unanswered questions. Everything right now is on credit. So U.S. consumer debt continues to rise. The U.S. government debt continues to rise. Corporate debt continues to rise. Everybody owes in the future. That's a problem. When does the bill come due? As we discussed, not all the money's in circulation. What happens when everyone starts to spend that money? There's not goods being produced. Eli Musk was on Joe Rogan's program and he said something that's very, very true. He said we have to make stuff. And the reason that the U.S. has a trade deficit is because we stopped making stuff. We started allowing everybody else to make stuff, and instead we just gave them some debt. We need to stop doing that. We need to figure out a way to bring manufacturing back to America. And that's part of the pause that this program's gonna take, probably for a month. I still have a great podcast on the PPP loans. I have one on bankruptcy as well that I'll come back and do. But I really want to sit down and work on some ideas for a better capitalist society, because I feel like the way that America is going right now, it's potentially going to destroy capitalism because of the crony capitalism that's happened with the greed and corruption of how governments run. So I want to put some good thought into that. Come up with some decent ideas that we need to deploy to help small businesses and also to just make capitalism work better for more Americans. And I think that's the problem we've got right now, is it doesn't. Anyway, back to MMT. So what happens when the inflation comes? What happens when all the loans we've given out, all the money printing gets put into the money supply? Right? Then what happens? The price of goods will go up. The price of everything will go up. That is what inflation is. When you have more money chasing fewer goods, that's what happens. And in this particular circumstance, it seems to me impossible that it could go any other way. It seems to me impossible that we don't have inflation. Now, when we start to get inflation, when it really starts to happen, whether that's from just the amount of money printing and the money supply, whether that's from foreign countries doing less and less work in dollars and it being used less and less as the reserve currency, whatever the, or all of the above, whatever it is, when inflation starts, is the government going to increase interest rates? Now, they've already said they expect to do nothing for at least 2 years, which is crazy to even say that. But if they raise interest rates, then how much more money does it cost the U.S. to service its debt when your debt is $25 trillion and growing? Every interest quarter point is billions of dollars. That's less money the U.S. has to spend on everything else, or more money it has to tax its citizens just to pay the debt. And this is the same conundrum that both people and companies run into. And this is the problem with the MMT, because while it sounds good to say, focus on the limits that matter, unless you've defined the limits, how much debt is too much? How much interest expense is too much? If you haven't defined what those limits are, then you're not having a fair conversation about what the government's going to do. Because if inflation starts to grow, which I think it's inevitable, are they going to increase interest rates? If they do, that'll A, slow down the economy, B, make assets like homes more expensive to purchase, which means prices have to drop for people to afford them based on the current level of income, right? What happens? I don't think they're going to raise interest rates. So that means that we got a different problem that's coming. All right. What about the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency? The assumption under MMT is that this continues in perpetuity. I don't believe that's the case. I think what you'll see is more and more countries start holding gold as their reserves instead of U.S. dollars or U.S. treasuries, and especially because U.S. treasuries pay so little. That now that the interest rate down on them is 1%, why? Why would I let you hold my money for 5 years, 10 years, 30 years if you're going to pay me a paltry 1%? I'll go find some other currency, some other country that's still growing and has the ability to grow. Now, we could see inflation from a few different areas, and the worst possible outcome, but I think the likely outcome, is what we see is stagflation. We're not going to have economic growth, but because of the money printing and because of the lack of U.S. dollars used to conduct international transactions as the reserve currency, we've got inflation, and we end up with what's called stagflation. We have an increase in prices, but no increases in wages or productivity. No increases in economic growth. And that's kind of worst world for everybody. And that means that all of a sudden, all Americans see a lower standard of living. And I think that's partly inevitable because we've been outsourcing all of the production and we've got this trade deficit, which again is another $500 billion of U.S. dollars that go out to the rest of the world that they get because we don't produce the goods we consume. So will we see our consumption drop in those areas, or will we see people not want dollars because there's still a lot of dollars floating around, and it could very quickly be that people don't want nearly as many of them. So what can you do to protect yourself and your assets? The first thing is buy assets, because assets usually increase in value with inflation. So land, property, buildings, these things increase. When there's inflation, you're able to charge people more because of inflation. And if your debt is stuck and stagnant, and especially at the current low interest rates, now all of a sudden you do quite well. And another thing to consider is your U.S. dollar-based assets. And U.S. dollar-based assets, I mean companies that do the majority of their business in the U.S., and U.S. treasuries, and U.S. dollars. So you could increase your holdings in foreign stocks, other countries that may not be printing as much money. So, for example, maybe it's Australia or New Zealand. And you go, okay, they have a very low GDP to debt ratio currently. So maybe I want to hold money in those currencies, or maybe I want to invest in their stock market. Because, again, it's not necessarily that the value of the stocks in New Zealand dollars, that those companies are going to grow faster but it's possible that the US dollar becomes weaker, and therefore priced in US dollars, those stocks are more valuable. And that is what I'm talking about that I believe is going to happen. The inflation that Americans are going to see is the lack of buying power from the US dollar on the long term. And I just think that's going to be a supply-demand issue because this modern monetary theory, I don't believe, holds weight. I think that the U.S. has already got too much debt. They were paying way too low of an interest rate, and pretty soon the world's going to demand a higher interest rate, and the amount of debt we have is not going to be sustainable, and they're going to have to raise taxes and interest rates, and no one's going to want to see that because it's going to significantly slow growth. But I think that's the reality that we're living in. So you may not want U.S. dollar held assets. Now, if you're a U.S. citizen, it's not super easy to just say, hey, I'm going to sell all my U.S. property and not live it while I still have to live in the U.S. and have no U.S. dollars. No, when you live in the U.S., you need the U.S. dollars. The American citizens are the ones that are going to keep using U.S. dollars because we have to. It's our currency here. But what I'm saying is you might have your house here in U.S. dollars. You might even have rental property here in U.S. dollars. And if inflation happens, hopefully you can charge more in rent as inflation goes up, and hopefully the value of those asset prices rises, not because the value of it's really more, but because, again, the value of the dollar is less. And that is specifically what we're talking about, the value of the dollar. Other options, and a whole different paradigm. And this one could be a whole podcast unto itself, and I don't want to spend an hour talking about it right now, but it is the coming strategy. Where all of a sudden, I've been one to say debt is bad. And usually when I say debt is bad, I mean consumer debt, especially credit card debt, excess car loan debt, excess student loan debt. Some debts are valuable. If you get a $50,000 loan to get an education, to get a job where you can pay that back within 5 to 10 years, and you have a better life going forward, that's valuable. If you're buying a home and using leverage, and especially if you're house hacking and having somebody else pay part of your rent, or if you're just reducing a rent payment every month for a mortgage and now you own the home, those are good uses of debt. There's good uses of debt and bad uses of debt. But here's the thing we haven't thought about for a while. Because we haven't had really high inflation in this country since the 1970s, we haven't considered that debt's not necessarily bad, or could switch from being bad to, actually, debt's a decent idea. And let me quickly explain what I mean. If you buy a house right now and you get a 2.5% interest rate, and inflation starts to happen, and interest rates rise, but so do property values, which is hard to have both happen at the same time because as interest rates rise, people lose buying power. But let's just say inflation happens and you buy a 10-unit apartment building right now, and inflation goes at 5% a year for the next 10 years. Well, your debt service payment is not going to go up. So your debt is fixed, and especially on a principal residence. So your debt is fixed at a low interest rate. Inflation happens, which means that eventually you get to charge more in rent because dollars are worth less than they were before. And as the rent goes up, the difference between the amount that you're receiving in rent and the amount of your debt payment continues to increase and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And when you have debt over really long periods of time at very low rates, that's very advantageous to you. And therefore, I would highly recommend to most people. So a lot of people are under I want my home paid off. Well, that's not a bad strategy, especially in a low inflation environment. However, in a high inflation environment, your home price value is going up, but you're getting no additional benefit from that if your home's paid off. Versus, let's say you own a $500,000 house, and it's completely paid off right now. Well, what if you went and took out a 30-year mortgage at 2.5%, and you took that money and you invested it in foreign stocks and got it out of the U.S. dollar? And let's say each year there's 5% inflation on the U.S. dollar, and let's just say you bought gold with it, And the price of gold is just the deflation of the dollar. So, or inflation of the dollar. So all of a sudden it's $1,000 to buy, well, now it's almost $1,800 an ounce to buy gold now. But let's just say that price keeps going up 5% every year as America has 5% inflation. Well, the value of that gold is going up 5% a year. The cost to you is 2.5% in interest. And all of a sudden, you're making money in between. And that's an easy example of how it works. But in general, you got to have a different thought perspective of debt. And especially if you can take it out now. Because right now, it's at low interest rates. But if inflation starts happening, that's going to change. And now all of a sudden, everyone else is paying higher rates, and you still have a lower rate. So that's one of the things you can do to protect yourself is have some debt, manageable debt, on physical assets. So here's my strategy that I'm deploying. I just got done finishing a refinance, 15 years still, 2.5%. Super low rate, 2.5% I'm very happy with. Now, I would have done a cash out refi and probably gone to a 30-year, but most of the mortgage lenders right now have canceled cash out refis because there's a liquidity crisis because of COVID-19 and people not making rent payments or mortgage payments. So I'm going to defer that. And I think we will have low rates, as the Fed has said, for the next couple of years. And then I expect the inflation to start kicking in as more and more money gets into the money supply and as fewer and fewer people use US dollars. So my plan right now is switch to a 15-year 2.5% mortgage. That's done. In 2 years, I plan to come back and refi that again, take as much money off the table as they will allow me, and move that to a 30-year. That'll actually reduce my payment at the same time I'm taking more money off the table. And I'll now lock in a low interest rate for 30 years. And that is part of my savings plan, because having low interest debt when inflation starts to happen means you're making money. And the theory is that, let's say I make $100,000 a year and inflation starts happening at 10% per year. Well, I might not get a $10,000 a year raise when inflation's 10%, but I might get 5. Right? But my home payment stays the same. So all of a sudden I went from making $100,000 to $105,000. So I get an extra $5,000 to pay my mortgage, but my mortgage didn't go up at all. So all of that extra money comes to me, which I will need to deal with the inflation and all the other goods and services that's going to happen. And with stagflation, that means that wages don't rise very fast, but inflation keeps happening. And that means every American loses purchasing power. So the idea behind buying gold in a large sense is just maintaining your purchasing power. Gold is the store of value. So what you can buy, typically a nice suit with an ounce of gold, will also be true in the future, but that ounce of gold will be $3,000, not $1,700. And Bank of America already came out and said they expect gold could go to $3,000 by the end of next year. That's depending on how much money printing the government continues to do. So there are things you can do to help yourself. So refinancing your home is one of them. Having a strategy and understanding how inflation works, and when in a high inflationary environment, debt is not bad. And to understand, especially right now, where you can lock in some long-term, low-rate debt, paid over 30 years, and my mortgage let's say it was 3%, but inflation's at 10. That's a huge, huge savings. This is one of the ways you can protect yourself and your assets and your purchasing power by locking in low interest rate debt now. Because in 5 years, that interest rate's probably going to be 10% too. And now you're going to go try and buy a property with a 10% interest rate, and your payment's going to be way up because you're paying way more in interest. The downside of that is going to be harder and harder to move. So pick where you want to live before you go do all this, and get to where you want to be living so that you're taking advantage in the next 2 years of this low interest rate environment to buy what you want to buy, knowing that inflation's coming shortly after. So refinance your home at lower rates. Potentially consider a rental property because, again, if inflation happens and you can lock in low rate on a rental property, that's not a bad idea. Buy physical stores of value. Gold and silver are really good ones, right? And then I'm going to talk about some of the things you can do right now to help yourself out. Here's some of the things that I'm doing. So I was using credit cards that had cash rewards points, especially airline points like Southwest points, things like this. I've moved strictly to using the credit cards that have cash back. And the reason why is those points can get inflated very, very quickly too. So as part of that strategy, I also want to use all the points I have right now. So the faster you use your points, the better. And I hear that a lot of travel is being booked up for next year because people are rolling over this year's travel they can't use. But if you've got travel plans, whatever you want to do, you've got points, miles, figure out how to redeem them, try and get that money out, because all they have to do is decide that it costs more points. So if we're going to end up with inflation in real money, what do you think is going to happen to inflation in points? All of a sudden, it's 50,000 miles to get an airline ticket. Next month, it could be 100. The month after that, it could be 1,000,000. They can change it any time they feel like. Right? So use your miles. Use all of them. Convert it to cash. Cash now, again, turned into gold and silver, is going to be a lot more valuable long-term than those points will be when they start inflating them. Increase the amount that you save and invest in assets that will increase in value. Foreign stocks, gold and silver mining companies. Those are all good ideas right now. And again, now you've seen under COVID how you can spend less money. Continue to do so. Like, yes, overall, if all Americans keep saving all of their money, is that bad for the economy? Probably a little bit, but that's not my problem. And I'm not going to spend more of my money just because that's better. Now, I will spend a lot of that free government money that they're handing out because, I don't really view that as mine. But other than that, I'm going to increase my savings. I'm going to try and refinance my house so I get a lower rate, which lowers my payment. I'm going to take the difference and not spend it. I'm going to invest it in other assets. So you get compounding returns in here. And again, into foreign stocks, into foreign assets, gold and silver mining companies, especially those not operating in US dollars, because they can sell gold in any currency they want to. Gold is the real reserve currency, because everybody will take that. Everybody will convert to gold. And I think that's what's going to happen is more and more, not necessarily converting it to physical gold, but either the US dollar is going to have to come back and be attached to gold, or some other currency is going to do it, and that will become the reserve currency. Be careful with your U.S. stocks. The other part to me that's crazy right now about the U.S. stock market, and I highly recommend to most people that you just get out as much as possible, is that while I expect prices to rise with inflation, and that would be the one argument right now for why stock prices have already risen, they're already factoring in this inflation. But there's another piece of that doesn't make any sense. A, profits will be lower, so the PDE ratios are crazier. And two, if we continue to run these deficits, eventually we have to pay more in taxes. So tax rates have to rise. And if you believe tax rates are going to rise, which I believe that they definitely will, then there's a few other strategies that you want to take in your personal life to try and move assets into lower taxed items. But also, corporations are going to get taxed a lot more. If Biden wins the White House, as I expect this fall, not because he's great. In fact, I think he's senile and too old for the job. I think we should have age limits on everything in Washington. I think if you're over 70, you shouldn't be allowed to run. Thank you for your service. Now go into retirement and teaching, and leave it to younger people to run the country, and let's get some turnover in there. I think that's one of the big problems that we have. But assuming Biden wins and the Democrats take the House and the Senate, which they very well could, I think they will spend a lot more money, and they will also increase taxes, which means that the valuations on the companies of their earnings, those are going to go way down because they're going to have to pay more in taxes. More in taxes means less earnings. So the PDE ratio means it is off on multiple things. One, taxes are going to increase. Two, earnings are going to drop. In fact, I think what I read today was 40% of companies aren't even offering any future guidance right now because of COVID. They have no idea. And I think that's probably pretty standard for all of us. None of us really know. But here's what I do know. When you keep printing money, supply-demand economics say that this is not complicated stuff. There's a pile of money on the table. They run the printing press and put more on it. You had a little stack on the side. Your stack didn't get bigger, which means what? The value you have in terms of your percentage of your pile to the whole just got reduced. That's inflation in a nutshell. I don't see how it can't happen. And I don't believe this MMT is going to turn out to be true at all. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think it's setting people up for this idea we can just continue to spend. And then when the US dollar ceases to be the world's reserve currency, the damage it does to the US and its citizens is going to be profound. And here's the other thing. It could happen really quickly. As in like 2008, when all of a sudden, Bear Stearns is going under and we have a massive financial crisis and nobody knows what to do. It could be a run on dollars in the same context, that the value of the dollar could drop so precipitously, so quickly, it would blow all of our minds. I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility. And therefore, you want to protect yourself. How do you protect yourself? Assets. Non-US based, non-dollar assets. And be smart. Get your debt locked in at low rates now. And in the future, you'll still have that very, very, very low debt payment. No different than somebody who bought their house 30 years ago. They don't have to pay the same amount now. They're not paying rent at all anymore. And we're paying higher and higher and higher rents. So it's the same concept as that. But start getting comfortable with this idea that all of a sudden, some debt, good use of debt, not such a bad idea. All right, thanks for listening. As I said, we're going to take a few weeks off. We'll be back probably in early August, and we've got some great things coming up for this fall. I've got some new design on how I want to do education and how I think it should be done. I think that finance education is sorely missed in this country, and if we gave people the right tools to understand it, that everybody would be a lot better off. And when you realize that everyone wants finance to be the easy button, but when you realize all the things that go into it, there are some fundamentals that everyone really should learn that can definitely help them and help them reduce their anxiety and stress levels and feel confident in their financial situation and their planning, and not give a ton of money to financial planners that you really don't need. In addition, we've got a book coming out on college, the college debt, the value proposition in its entirety. Not all college debt is bad, but a lot of it is, and costs continue to rise, and the value proposition continues to be examined. And there's some new research out on this, as well as obviously we're dealing now with some COVID times of potentially a lot more classes online, and is the value the same? And you have an employer perspective on that, and there's a degree perspective. So lots of things to consider, and we expect to release that hopefully this fall. And start up some new curriculum on classes. So thanks for listening. Please share with your friends and family. Please do all the liking on Facebook and Instagram, and give us a review if you can in the wherever you get your podcast from, or on YouTube. And we appreciate your support, and talk to you soon. Cheers.